is Danielle Aguas, and I'm the Vice President of Client Engagement at Center for Executive Excellence. And I'm joined here today by the co-founders of Center for Executive Excellence, Sheri Nasim and Dr. Tony Barron. And in today's webinar, Sheri will interview Tony on the subject of self-leadership in the age of isolation. It's a really relevant topic today. We're excited to be joining you virtually, and we welcome you. Before we get started though, some quick housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar, and we will share the recording link with anyone who's registered. So be on the lookout for that link in your inbox later today. And I also want to mention that we're using Zoom's webinar feature to host today's event. So you will be on mute and your video is turned off as a participant. Only myself, Sheri, and Dr. Barron have the ability to have video and mics turned on. But you will notice that you have a Q&A button on your screen's dashboard. If we do have time today, we will answer some of your questions at the end, so please feel free to submit some questions. If we don't get to those questions though, please feel free, if you had a question later that you thought of, we encourage you to email us with your question to info@executiveexcellence.com. That's info@executiveexcellence.com, and I'll have a slide at the end with that email address. Our plan is to end no later than 12 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, so you can all get back to your regularly scheduled programs. So with that, here's Sheri.
Yay, thank you, Danielle, and thank you to each and every participant in today's webinar. I'm so excited today to introduce our guest and my friend, Dr. Tony Barron. Just with a little background on Dr. Barron, in 1993, he founded the Barron Center, incorporated in San Diego. It was a consulting firm that was pioneered the research on violence programs, both in the workplace, in schools, and governments, and he actually penned and published several books after the research that he found on that subject. He counseled survivors from the Oklahoma City bombing of the Murrah building in 1995, the Columbine High School massacre in '99, as well as survivors from September 11, 2001 attack on the World Trade Center. In 2009, Dr. Barron accepted the role as president of the Servant Leadership Institute in San Diego, California, to help spread the concept of servant leadership to organizations here on the West Coast, while leading sold-out conferences featuring speakers such as eminent authors Ken Blanchard and John Maxwell, Southwest Airlines President Emeritus Colleen Barrett, and WD-40 CEO Gary Ridge. Dr. Barron studied transformational leadership in corporate America and religious organizations. His work resulted in the publication of 2 books on the subject. One was The Art of Servant Leadership in 2010, and The Cross and the Towel, which was published in 2011, which is a call to action for Christian leaders to set aside ego, political correctness, and selfish ambition in their ministry. But I met Dr. Barron while he came to be the president of the Servant Leadership Institute. We formed an immediate relationship then that I am so happy to tell you that we've continued all of these years since. So gosh, it's been maybe 15 years, Tony?
I think so.
Keeps going. Yep. So when Tony and I meet together, not only is he a friend and a mentor and a coach, but he's a scholar. He has a double doctorate in psychology and theology. And so you can imagine that when Tony and I sit down one-on-one to talk about the difference between power and leadership and how those are conflated sometimes in our society, how Tony, delves into not only his scholarly studies, his academic experience, but also decades of experience of coaching leaders in Fortune 100 companies. You can imagine the depth and breadth of that Tony adds to our talk. So you don't have to imagine that today. You get to see what it's like yourself to chat with a true scholar during a time when I think we can all use some refreshing insight and inspiration. So Tony Barron, my friend, welcome to today's webinar.
I'm glad to be here. Are we out of time already?
No, I have a lot more to say. You just sit
Oh,
there
okay.
and stare at the camera. I tried to cut that down, but you've just done so much, and I want people to know how incredible you are
Well, thank you.
professionally. So before we launch into the Q&A, I just want to give the audience a little bit of background about your personal lifelong leadership path. If you'll indulge me a little bit more, your parents were from Poland. Your mother, who was Jewish, was in an arranged marriage with a man who was 20 years her senior. The Russians captured her husband during World War II, and your mother never heard from him again. She was herself captured a week after her husband and was sent to Siberia, where she was forced to take part in building her own compound. Meanwhile, your father, who had grown up on the western side of Poland, was captured by the Germans not once, but twice. He had 11 brothers and sisters, 9 of which died in the war. And after the war, both your mother and father ended up migrating to America, where they eventually landed in Los Angeles and met for the first time in 1953. In a manuscript that you and I worked on together about transformational leadership, you write that perhaps the only thing your parents had in common was that they were Polish and were both prisoners of war. And you were born into that marriage in 1955, and you were their only child. You shared openly that as a child of that marriage, you felt the force of latent effect of the abuse of power that had on your parents, on their marriage, and ultimately on their ability to parent you. Your childhood effect was an indoctrination, you say, of how the misuse of power could cause the suffering of innocent people, far beyond the immediate abuse of that power. You were emancipated from your parents at the age of 16, was it?
16. Yes.
Wow. And dedicated yourself to studying how we conflate power with leadership in both the secular and non-secular worlds. So my first question, and thank you for being so patient with me, is on the subject of self-leadership. I'm sure that when you grew up, you recognized that your parents loved you in the only way that they could, but they were not the role models that you turned to in your youth. So what role models did you turn to, and who inspired you to take responsibility for self-leadership at such a young age?
Well, Sheri, I became very much aware how power can be abused and misused, and how normal people just want to lead a peaceful life like my parents did. But because power can be good, and we see in WW2, power can be very evil, it made me realize that my parents were damaged because of the misuse and abuse of power. And so I was really drawn to people that utilize power in the right way. And I was growing up, there was one person that really stood out for me, and that was Martin Luther King Jr. And I was intrigued by him because most people, when they're dealing with issues of power and injustice, they resort to the same methods as the people that are superior. Violence begets violence. But it wasn't true of Martin Luther King at all. In fact, his whole resistance was based on passivity, was based on peaceful journeys, still standing up for what is right, engaged in that. And so even as a young lad, I would watch him and model after him and see the things that he did, and really got me into focusing on the whole issue of power as I developed through college and graduate school and so forth. So I would say the most influential person I had growing up was probably MLK.
Yes, yeah. It's the passivity is interesting, such an opposite response, and that we've seen that repeated in other amazing leaders who have stood the test of time.
Yeah, abuse of power, when you see it, what often happens is those that have been victimized by it, when they finally get into power, they end up abusing themselves, abusing other people, because they're now in leadership. And it's really the wrong way to deal with it. And that's why transformational servant leadership is really the model that Martin Luther King really did all the way. Also Nelson Mandela and other folks.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Gandhi,
Yes.
Mother Teresa. When we were designing the Reimagine Leadership Summit this year, that was supposed to take place a week from today, by the way.
I know.
Sorry about that, guys.
I know. Yeah, that's okay. We'll still hold it. We're holding. Anyway, when it seemed like ages ago, long before the coronavirus upended the world, we were talking about the agenda for the day, and we plan to set aside the entire first half dedicated to this idea of self-leadership, even before the coronavirus, just turned everything upside down. And we talked about how leaders today are bombarded by a barrage of stress, constant distractions, lack of sleep, hijacking of our brains by technology, and 24/7 breaking news. And it was virtually impossible to lead other people well until we get in touch with ourselves and recognize how we're out of balance and then get ourselves back in balance first. So I'm curious, Tony, if you can share with us what has occurred to you since this pandemic hit about the topic of self-leadership in an age of isolation.
And it is an age of isolation filled with crisis and stress and anxiety and the uncertainty of what the future will bring. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about that. Self-leadership obviously starts with you as a leader. And usually I focus with groups and talk about two aspects of it. One is moral excellence and the other one is emotional intelligence, incorporating both of them. When I do my lectures on emotional intelligence, I focus on the issue of how to live a life of peace. And whether it's inner peace and outer peace, how to exhibit that in a day-by-day situation where you manifest a non-anxious presence while all the world is kind of going crazy. And I know you can probably go to the websites of several places and find little trinkets or little things that can help you in terms of calming your life. But if you don't mind, Sheri, I'd like to share with the group in terms of how do we create this inward peace and this outward peace to other people around us and to assist. And here's the key, is that you and I have to arrange our life in such a way, we have to arrange our life in such a way that we are committed so that we are experiencing deep joy, contentment, and confidence in your everyday life. So ask yourself the question. I have a mentor of mine, Dallas Willard, who passed away 7 years ago this past May. And Dallas would say, if people really want to change, they're going to have to do three things. And he would call it VIM, vision, intention, and means. And vision, I think, is very important. If you want to live a peaceful existence, you have to have a vision of what that would be like. So ask yourself a question. What would it be like to live your life with that deep sense of peace? Let me give you a definition of peace, because if you look it up on Webster or some other dictionary, you find peace is often given as an absence of conflict. But that's not really my understanding of what peace is. Peace, from the Eastern mindset, is more holistic in terms. It's a state of well-being. It's a pervasive sense of well-being that is accompanied with joy in one's life. And if we wanted to do it from a corporate sense, that well-being is that non-anxious presence in the midst of all the crisis, in the midst of all the situations. You and I talked about leadership, and one of my books, I say leadership is really, comes from an idea of a ship captain steering a ship in the middle of a storm. Mm-hmm. And you have to have this non-anxious presence to be successful in doing that. And then once you have that vision of what that peace would look like in your life, then you have to be intentional, because nothing happens by accidents. You can't drift into peace. It can't be imposed upon you by other people. It has to be an intentional activity that you have. Mm. And then when you have that vision and that intention, then finally the means, the little tools, the little instruments that help you be successful in that can be very helpful and long lasting as long as you have the vision in mind. So in a very simple way, this diagram of a triangle can be helpful for us to understand how to create this life of inner and outer peace. And it's in and it's out and it's up in concept, but let me focus on the in part, for example. The in side of your life, if you want to have the means to be successful, you need to begin the process of being intentional in terms about your thought life, removing negativity from your thinking, making up your mind that you want to spend more time with individuals within your family. For example, limiting your exposure to all the digital use that we have in access. I mean, studies have indicated that you shouldn't even be watching any screen for at least an hour before you go to bed because of the stimulation that it corrects. Mm. And so we really need to spend time on that inward part of our life that we're changing regarding ourselves. For example, breathing. Just the very act of 7-7-7, breathing deeply for 7 seconds, hold your breath for about count to 7, and then releasing for 7 seconds creates this whole aspect of that inward life that you have. That in is really important, and you know you're doing it right because one of the things that will manifest from the in your life is the concept of gratitude. When your inner life is well, you become a grateful person to have that. Now, we do know what makes lack of peace. For example, the ancients have done writings about this the longest time. Let me just share with you about 7 of them they mentioned. Gluttony, anger, greed, envy, pride, lust, indifference. All those factors are what disturbs peace, and that's why the inner life is so important. But you can't have peace completely by just contemplating the way you need to change internally. What you have to do is also have an out. And that out that we're talking about is really, and the key word here is generosity. It's that we find that peaceful individuals, people that have a high level of joy and contentment and peace in their life, do things for others. They are generous about their time, about their treasures, about the talent that they have. They spend time with their kids or their grandkids or the family members or people that they can help. In fact, we've seen that on television, many places during the COVID-19 pandemic that we're having, that many people are reaching out to people that need help and assistance. And so they're out there waving to people, talking to people, being happy. And this out is so critically important for you to have this level of peace. And as a result of that, you find that you're generous. Studies have indicated that other life actually combats narcissism. If you don't have that out, what happens is you build this sense of just entitlement that creates really a psychological disorder and disordered desires that are very narcissistic in intent. Now, most of the websites, by the way, have the in and out, but my postdoctoral studies that I did was with Dr. Herbert Benson at Harvard Medical School. And it was interesting to me, he wrote this tremendous book way before you guys were born called The Relaxation Response. And what he did was, as he wrote this book, was study around the world people that were able to relax and manifest their sense of peace. And he indicated there's a third dimension that's really important besides the in and the out, and that's the up relationship. And some people would say that's a higher power. Other people would say God. And I would say that whatever that is in terms of that up relationship is that you begin to have this understanding that there's somebody or something out there that is active and is able to do things that you cannot do on your own. Mm-hmm. That unmerited favor that's destined that we call grace. Let me give you an example of that. If one has this in and this out and this grace that happens, several years ago in the late 1990s, I was consulting with several members of the Denver Broncos. And it was that particular year that they went to the Super Bowl and were playing the Green Bay Packers. And it was in San Diego. And so we had several retired Broncos. One in particular stayed at our house. We had a great time. And I remember that game. And was going back and forth, back and forth. And Broncos lost three Super Bowls. And I'm thinking, no, they can't lose another one. And finally, at the very end, they win the game. Well, Sheri, I got to tell you, I was nervous. I was nervous the whole time. But as my wife and I were watching that game and being nervous, I also back there put a tape on. For those who are too young, we used to have these things called tapes, and made them DVDs and so occasionally I will now change that tape into a DVD, and then I'll watch it, that same game. And I'm not that nervous anymore. Mm. I actually know who wins. Well, what Herbert Benson has found in his studies that those that have that up relationship has this sense of a grace-filled life, that they have this sense of peace in what they have. So critically, you need that to have this sense of this non-anxious presence, this holistic well-being. You need to have this in and this out and this up relationship. That makes sense?
Wow. I have so many. Yes. That's so. I love the simplicity of the graph, and you can't fake inner peace.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
You cannot.
And yet we're all, our whole world has just been shaken upside down, and so it's really important for us. Whether you're a leader, I think of a multinational conglomerate, or an individual who has influence over other people, which, don't we all? We all are responsible for this, taking control of a non-anxious presence. Go ahead.
What happens for that is that people settle not for this holistic sense of well-being. What they settle for is an absence of conflict. So they begin to focus simply on the pleasure principle of their life, try to achieve as much as lack of conflict in life. But that's only temporary, because it's usually based upon the factor of happiness. This kind of peace is actually based on a pervasive sense of well-being that creates joy, and it makes you, when circumstances happen, not react. It actually helps you respond. Mm-hmm. It's a process, but it's something that's very important.
And it's a skill that you have to build, would you say? We're not born.
Well, we're certainly not born with that. As you mentioned earlier, my background was, my parents both struggled with PTSD. They were very abusive, struggled with anger in those areas. I know they did the best they can, but if I was to look at my life started with a -2. Mm. And so it takes a lot of time to work on that. That's why you need to first start with that vision. What would my life be like in that condition? And secondly, you have to be intentional. And that intention is really important, and you'll move up 3 steps, but maybe you'll take a step or 2 back, and then you move forward. But you still have to be intentional in that area. And the more you learn those habits, the daily disciplines of those things, it becomes easier and easier. Like anything, when you start a new diet or an exercise program, the toughest times is when you start, right?
Yeah.
So after the process, it becomes a little bit easier. It goes beyond information. It goes to incarnation.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I love that. Gosh, if anybody, has a reason to have developed an incredibly narcissistic, personality, you could have, because your parents weren't there to take care of you. And yet you had a calling, I think, for that leadership was important, and you felt like there was something else in life. So
what I've seen with people is usually their calling is based upon the wounds that they've suffered.
Wow.
Like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that calling they had was from the wounds that they had and the suffering they had. Nelson Mandela's calling that he had, it dealt with his prison sentence of many decades. So those usually lead to what one's calling is, really the wounds we have.
So I have a question, a snowball question, because this is how we normally have a conversation. How are we doing on time, Danielle? Good?
Yeah, we're doing pretty good.
Okay. So what you just said makes me think that, that part of the up, you said maybe a higher power or God. Can up also be our belief in, our better selves, our belief in that we have the ability as humans to to do the best ourselves, and we believe in the better part of human spirit.
Yeah, so strength finders would say that's your balcony that you have, but I'd actually put that on an end. What I would do is put what Dr. Keltner said at Berkeley, the word awe, A-W-E, and that sense of creation that you begin to see. The awe moments are the ones that create the up. That is, you actually see things and experience things and spend time with, whether it's a sunset or whether it's something beautiful ocean or seven wonders of the world or whatever it is.
Yeah.
That you end up with that awe experience. And what it does is creates transcendence. And that's the key. The transcendence is really important. That's why awe, if you want to use another word, I'd put that up there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can see us drawn to some combination of screens to get connection with other people, and outdoors right now, maybe because we can't, it's something that we can't have, but we're finding awe and taking longer walks and just looking up at the sky and walking barefooted in our own backyards or feeling the sun on our skin, whatever that is. So. You talked about Dr. Keltner. You and I had the pleasure of visiting Dr. Keltner at UC Berkeley when his book, The Power Paradox, came out. And it was fascinating to us because it was not only the study of power, but how power impacts our brains. And Professor Keltner and his students did some MRI studies and some social studies to show that when a person gets a little hit of any kind of power, that they also get a hit of dopamine to the brain. And that dopamine has the effect of suppressing our ability to empathize, which is, that's the paradox of power, which means it's really important for us to be intentional, like you said, to continue to work on ourselves first so that we can offset that, what's happening to our brains. But I'm wondering about empathy now. What should leaders do or know about how empathy, we can tap back into that, during the days of the coronavirus and rethink, ways in which we may have been encouraging separation and division with those we influence.
Well, it's interesting when in the out, I think that's where empathy needs to be developed. And sometimes when the older I get, I actually, my convictions are not as many, but what they are is some things that I'm willing to die for. And what I find is that many times when I was younger, I thought I was perfectly right about something. And so many times I had a greater need to be right than I had really in building relationships and be empathic and understanding everybody's story. So, and that's probably not what our audience problem is, but when the reality is we have to, what Stephen Covey would say, seek first to understand before being understood. Really begin to understand the framework of where they live. When I was growing up as a teenager with my parents, I knew their prison word, but I didn't understand till I read books, till I studied, till I began to see things and just kind of just trying to understand the world, which gave me great empathy in the pain that they were going through, the nightmares that they experienced in life that as a very selfish teenager, I wasn't thinking about, during those times. So trying to live in the other person's shoes, to try to have that understanding is really important, I believe, to increase that and feel okay that life has a lot of things about knowledge, but even in science, there's a lot of things that is a mystery. So whether we're talking about politics or science or religion or leadership or those kind of things, there's a framework for you how to conduct yourself in such a way that people grow. For example, Greenleaf. We know Greenleaf's books and so well is that when Greenleaf says the test of true servant leadership is, are the people I'm encountering, are they better off by me being with them or the things that I wrote? That's his test for servant leadership. Mm-hmm. Are they better off? And many times we'll find leaders that they use people as tools as opposed to having dignity. and you and Mike talked about, is that if you increase efficiency and and dignity will always fall down, and the true leader will have dignity and efficiency at the same time. The need to be right and the need to have a relationship are both very important.
Yeah, that's good. That's so good. Thank you. So, Tony, what are you doing to practice self-care these days?
Well, as you know, my wife is going through cancer treatments right now, and so part of my self-care is trying to do the best I can and getting to sleep, and just I can be fully present with her. It's one of the reasons why I retired recently from the university, and to spend more time. She's devoted her life to me, and I want to make sure that I can reciprocate and do the same thing back to her. So sleep to me is really important when we get it, and doing some exercise and those kind of things are really important. And I love reading. So part of my self-care is just reading. I literally right now simultaneously reading in 4 different rooms, 4 different books. And it's just a lot of fun.
That is fun. That is fun. Danielle, I have one more question for Tony. I have lots more, but I have one more I want to get in. And then if you want to, we can see if the audience has any questions. Tony, I just love you. Okay. If you had a wish for one indelible change that you'd like to see in leaders after we resume business or whatever that looks like, what would it be?
I think for every leader to truly take a Sabbath. One day a week, turn everything off. One day a week to be fully present with those that you are close to and love. One day a week, get away from your business world that you have and live in the most important world that you have. And so I think the sense of a Sabbath is so critically important that one has to get away from that technology, get away from the things that you have, and really have this sense of rest.
It's really good. That's good. All right, Danielle. I always have more questions for Tony, but I don't want to take up all the air. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. We do have a couple of questions that have come through. One question is, what's another crisis that you've lived through similar to this one that's required the level of self-leadership you've talked about today?
Well, I was called to Columbine after, there's no crisis like this pandemic. This is the worst that we've ever been to in that particular area. But when back in the 1990s, when I was working with most of the Fortune 100 companies in that area, when I wrote one of my books, Violence in the Workplace, the Postal Service called me. And if you can remember back then, all the postal shootings that occurred. And I was there when the term was done, going postal, and I would do my organization would train individuals at the time. So I've seen the ugliness of life. I've seen more dead bodies than I'd like to see. I've seen more situations that have developed. And so I think most of my crisis aspects that I've dealt with really has to deal with workplace and school violence situations in terms of my life.
Mm.
Wow. Yeah. And then I know that just from knowing you as long as I have, and when you tell stories about the impact being in those conditions was on yourself, I'm always impressed at how you've been able to endure and still teach on leadership and have a positive outlook given the amount of violence you've seen and suffering. So I've been really impressed by that in the, what is it now, 16 plus years that I've known you. So.
Can I share something about that? Because that's how I got in leadership, by the way. It was that to have a critical incident, you needed to have a person plus the environmental factors plus the triggering event, and that would equal a critical incident. What we began to study is, I traveled around the country. I was an expert witness in court. I had everything from Warner Brothers to Universal Studios to major universities, working with them. But what I began to find out was the environmental factors people weren't paying attention to. And we found 15 environmental factors that led to increased aggression. And every one of them had to deal with leadership, every one of them. And so I began to have a division within my own company that dealt with organizational development and dealing with leadership. And that's what got me so committed to the concept of transformational servant leadership, is that we have to change the way leaders do things. And it was so important for me.
That's great. Well, we have time still for a few more questions. Are you doing okay?
I'm doing fine.
Okay. Another question is, what's a daily practice that if there was something that leaders can do every day that you would recommend that they do?
Some people talk about meditation, prayer. Meditation are things that are really important. For me, I journal. That's one aspect to do that. I like to take walks when I can, not far walks, but walks where there's a lot of greenery, to be able to see those kind of things. I'm a trained extrovert when I speak to people, but I'm really an introvert. And so I need that kind of alone time, an absence of stimulation, with the exception of Bobby, that I just love when she's with me, to do that where I can recharge my batteries. So when I get lost in those kind of things, the walk, the nature, those kind of things are very helpful for me.
That's great. Another question that came in is, if you were called in to consult with the current administration, what would you tell them?
If they're referring to the current administration in Washington, D.C.?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's a huge question to deal with. Basically, what I would recommend for all leaders is to manifest moral intelligence, emotional intelligence, the ability to communicate with grace, the ability not to react but to respond, ability to work in a form of cooperation, and really seek to do the things that we need to do. Get all the experts you can, like I think that's what's happening right now in dealing with COVID-19, but to do the things that we can work together as much as we can. Find things that we have in common, as opposed to things that really separate us.
Instead of things that divide. I like that. Do you have any input about how to process through the difficulty, grief, and anxiety during this difficult time? And how do you support those, or how do we support those we work with?
Okay. What a great question. Many times people get lost in their anxiety. And what I mean by that is they act like the stock market, that the stock market is based upon fears and what ifs and speculation and those kind of things that happen. So our emotions go up and our emotions go down in what we have. And the key for us for that inner peace is this ability that we have to actually realize that that world out there is that world and we don't have control of it. But we do have control of the world that we live in, and how we respond is really important, and to work in that venue. So I believe that everyone should try to control what they can control, and not spend an incredible amount of time thinking about speculation of what may happen in the future. Really focus on the present. The present moment is really so critically important to live there. Many people live in the guilt of the past or the anxiety of the future. Well, you don't have enough grace for either one of those things, but you have enough grace to live in the present moment. And so that's what I would recommend for people.
I love that. Thank you so much. That's all the questions that we have that we got from the audience. Please feel free to submit more questions. We do have a few more minutes. And well, if anyone has a question, please use the Q&A box to submit it. And I don't know, Sheri, if you want to ask, I know you could do this for hours with Tony, but is there another question you want to ask while we wait? We can also wrap up early. It's up to you.
I do. Tony, if it was just you and I sitting together in our booth and Pizza Nova in San Marcos, yay, Pizza Nova.
Yep.
I would push back on something that you said in a teasing way about, one of the questions that I was going to ask you was, have you struggled to find, the space to focus on advice right now, or, do you really find the solace in taking the time to think back about, the impact that this crisis will have? And you said you were reading books. You're reading 4 books at the same time. So I'm wondering if that's your normal habit, or are you a little bit unfocused in your?
No, actually, it's my normal habit. When you're teaching in universities, you're always reading new things. And one of the joys now is that I'm reading books I've read in the past. So I'll have one of my favorite authors is C.S. Lewis, and I'll read him in one area. I'm reading Roger Olson from Baylor University. I'm reading his work in terms of history coming together. So it's been my normal pattern. I've done it for the last 30 years. So
it sounds like that's a scholarly answer. And it makes sense. It's really actually fascinating. I would think if you lay out different authors, I don't know if it's about different the same topic or if they're from the same era, but how fascinating to see what different people have to say. And
it really is. Yeah, it's and it's something that I enjoy to do. And what happens is my mind is always thinking about those things and what they communicate and I really believe that my life I always have to rethink what I think. I really want to have the ability to always challenge the way I think about things. And so that I need to be a lifelong learner. I think most people do actually, but that you're always learning. And the moment you stop learning, you stop growing. Ken Blanchard would always talk about ego being edging God out. And I say, ego means edging growth out. That if you're not growing out there, that's because you have a large ego and you don't want to be learning.
Yeah. I was just thinking about when you were describing your career, when you were the go-to person for all intents and purposes for a while, when all of these violent acts were going on around the country, and you were consulting leaders in Fortune 100 companies, and I know that was a very active period for you. You were on the road quite a bit, and I would be curious to find out, to ask you, what did you have to rethink a little bit about yourself along the way, especially when you were starting to realize that leadership was one of the 3 factors that you have to have good, or whether it's toxic or a very positive leadership in terms of a critical incident. So how did you change your own thinking about yourself during that time?
Well, here's a sense of vulnerability. Actually, when I was traveling about 200 to 250 days a year around the country, I was doing a very poor job of self-care. And the tyranny of the urgent was really coming on. So I played a role of being an authority and doing the things that we had, and being there when you're a professional, when you're dealing with stress or those type of things, you're very much on. And then when that stressful period of time or the crisis is over and no one's around there, that's when you kind of start falling apart. And I fell apart in terms of my diet, my lack of exercise, lack of balance in terms of integration that was there. I was realizing that I was heading in this kind of downward spiral where it was, and I wasn't experiencing that peace. I was making an incredible amount of money. I was becoming very well known across the United States. I was doing all those type of things, but I didn't have that peace.
Wow, yeah.
That I was engaged in. And Bobby and I really had to make some serious changes in my life to get back to what I was really missing.
Sounds like Bobby, you're implying that Bobby had a little bit of a influence on you there.
She's the greatest influence on my life. Yes.
Yay. Yay for Bobby.
I actually do have a couple more questions. I think both of you could probably answer this one. This is a fun one. If you could recommend 3 books to start a library, what would you recommend?
Oh my. That's such a big question.
It is. I
love it though.
I can start. Actually, someone who's on this webinar, or he's participating, his name is Knight Campbell, recommended a book called A More Beautiful Question. It's the power of inquiry to spark breakthrough ideas. And I just love that it forces us to really think about the power of the question, and how asking good questions can actually unlock things that we didn't know were there and help solve problems or identify problems. It can be a real game changer. And so I found, I think it's Warren Berger, who wrote the book, More Beautiful Question. And I'm loving it. I'm reading it right now, Knight. I know you're listening. And it's a great book. So, A More Beautiful Question, a great one for leaders. It's not just in the answers, but they have you have to ask the right question to get a breakthrough answer, in my opinion. So,
good.
Yeah, that's my recommendation. What about you guys?
I don't think about books. I think about authors, like my mentor, Dallas Willard. Dallas not only was the smartest man I ever met, he was the one who was manifested peace in a consistent way, more so than any other human being I have ever met my entire life.
Mm.
And as professor at USC for over 40 years in the Department of Philosophy, he had this uncanny ability that you knew that he cared about you, and at the same time was a deep thinker about things that were really important. So if you pick up anything on Dallas Willard, I certainly would do that. My wife and I just finished reading one of Dallas's books a long time ago on Psalm 23. And it was really powerful because it deals with peace and dealing with that aspect. But anything Dallas has, I think would be really powerful.
It's great.
Oh, I'd love to play the game. I think I love bending the rules a little bit, because I agree, Tony, that authors, when they're really great, you want to read everything that they've written. Doris Kearns Goodwin is one of my favorites. I'm reading Leadership in Turbulent Times right now. My Team of Rivals is just right here on my bookshelf. I love Team of Rivals. She's really, really good. So she's an excellent writer, but she's an amazing historian. David McCullough, anything written by David McCullough is just amazing. And I love William Least Heat Moon. He writes nonfiction, but he's just has such a beautiful way with words, and I think literature is just as important as leadership lessons in history.
Aren't they glad that we didn't mention any of our books or anything?
And if you act now.
Can we do one more question, you guys? And I know that I see a lot of questions came through. Thank you, everyone, for submitting your questions. We will, I'm going to capture these questions and get back to you in an email. But I do want to ask one more that was in the doc that was next in line. It was, actually, it's a little bit long, and then there's a question, and it goes like this. I feel guilty when I take time off for personal wellness because I am usually asking my people to keep working on technical challenges while I'm tackling strategy and adaptive problems. Any advice on how to message this or come to terms with the dissonance?
Go ahead, Tony.
Get a dog. Sorry about that, guys. So, I think while you're encouraging them to solve the problems that are there, but you should also communicate to them that they need to find ways and provide ways for them for their care. You need to communicate that as well. And so that they know that you are interested in them not only completing the task, but you are interested in them as a person, in who they are. that this is just not a tool to complete the task as a person. So I would kind of change my conversation with them in that particular area. And that probably would relieve some of your guilt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Make sure that you understand that whatever it is that you're going through, they're going through the same, and they have a first line responder task. And so use that gratitude that Tony talked about earlier to express to them, hey, I know that, I'm so grateful for you helping us during this critical time. How are you doing? What are you doing to take care of yourself? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Love it. Thank you. Well, I think for the sake of time, I guess we got about 8 minutes. I'm going to just, in terms of wrapping up here, first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're just kickstarting this webinar series, and we appreciate you joining us. We'd love to hear from you. I'm going to put up a slide in a moment with our email address if you have any lingering questions. I know we have lots of questions that came through in the last 15 minutes. So we'll gather those and look those over as a team and get back to you with some answers. As a reminder, you will be receiving today's webinar link, the recording, in an email, hopefully later today, once that is finished converting. And we will be sending out also communications about future webinars that we're going to be hosting along with guest speakers. Again, this is a series. We're gonna try to do this every few weeks for as long as we're in this time, and we want to mix up the topics as well. If you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to hear, please also email us with those suggestions. But please save the date for our next webinar. It's Tuesday, May 5th. At 11 a.m., it's featuring Sheri Nasim, who is a Fortune 500 executive known in the fintech sector as a turnaround leader, who excels at mobilizing and motivating cross-functional teams to challenge the status quo and drive performance. And he currently serves as the founder of U.S. Financial Relief, a financial services company that focuses on debt resettlement and restructuring that helps Americans in their time of financial hardship with education and individualized service. So we're really excited to hear from him. That's Tuesday, May 5th at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We will be sending out an e-blast about that. We are working on a schedule with more speakers. So we look forward to sharing that with you once that's ready to go. And I know I promised, let me get you that slide in case you didn't get the email address. It's info@executiveexcellence.com. Let me share my screen again. Any additional questions? I know we got some through the Q&A box today, but any new questions that come up in the next few days or after this webinar, please send them to us. We'd love to sort through them, really think about them intentionally and thoughtfully. So send us your questions, info@executiveexcellence.com. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Tony Barron, for sharing your time with us. We know it's especially a difficult time and season for you right now. We send our best for Bobby, for her healing, and we thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you. Say, give our love to Bobby.
Will do. You guys take care.
You too.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.